1974, and I graduated from Beijing Language University as an English major in 1995, and I came to the US in the year of 2000, completing my PhD degree in history, Chinese history in 2006. And after that, I started to teach at Allegheny College, Pennsylvania, US. And so far, I have published several books, a couple of journal articles, and have been working on research on China, different time periods and different aspects from modern history to now. I'm more geared towards ancient Chinese history and the history of the relationship between Confucianism and Buddhism in Chinese history.
Fascinating. Fascinating. So the topic of today, Professor Wu, is what is decolonization?
I would like to understand the decolonization on two levels. The first level, I would call the political decolonization, which is a more visible political process in which lots of these colonies toppled their colonizers, especially after the end of World War II. We know the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. We know lots of new nation states that gained their independence after World War II from their old imperialist and colonial governance, mainly the British Empire. One prominent example could be just India and Pakistan. They gained their independence from British colonial rule after World War II, which was for them it was 1947, and this was political decolonization. But another level was intellectual decolonization, which I'm more interested in and more concerned about at present, because political decolonization was straightforward. It's clear because they already happened. Lots of countries in Africa and in Asia had already gained their independence in the past decades. And we might think they are independent and they would not have colonization as a problem or as a baggage, historical baggage on their society or on their system. But a more tricky or even subtle question was this decolonization on the cultural and the intellectual level, which was even after these countries gained their independence, or even if you look at China, even after China gained full independence, after China cast off its former status as a so-called semi-colonial country, the cultural dominance of these old imperialist and colonial powers might exist in other forms. Like when we look at history and when we were trying to interpret history, our own society and our own history, we are so used to using his theoretical frameworks laid down by those old colonial powers, to the extent that we ignored that there is actually a possibility that indigenous cultures could produce its own way of interpreting itself. And this type of interpretative frameworks could be more useful, more valid than a Western theoretical framework or a Western paradigm in interpreting the social realities in non-Western societies. And that was why there was such a debate, which I'm not going to pick a side right now, that there has long been a debate, an intellectual debate and substantial effort in both mainland China and Taiwan about the possibility of sinicization or sinification of sociology, because we know sociology is a field with lots of theories, lots of theoretical thinking and theoretical framework. And can we come up with a Chinese way of interpreting Chinese society with the Chinese terminologies and the Chinese way of thinking, Chinese approaches, rather than simply adopting Western sociological terminologies and their frameworks? There has been lots of debates on this. And we know there's an eminent Chinese sociologist, Fei Xiaotong, who came up with some very interesting and also valid terminologies. He actually invented some terminologies to interpret Chinese society. And that was probably the first step of interpreting China by using Chinese terminologies coined by Chinese people. Or to take that one step further, can we use Chinese terminologies and Chinese theories and Chinese interpretive frameworks to interpret the West? While we use lots of Western terminology, we use Western vocabulary, Western terminologies, Western theories to interpret non-Western societies. Can we use non-Western terminologies and concepts to interpret the West?
That's a
There is a possibility.
fascinating idea. It would be extraordinarily interesting, especially because from a colonial or from a empire position, which now the dominant empire would be the United States, and prior to that would have been Great Britain, and prior to that, would have been the Dutch, and then the first global empire was Portugal and Spain. But it's actually very interesting because what I interpret you're saying in here, it creates a vocabulary, and that vocabulary in here becomes the dominant base by which everything else is based on. Like, for example, everything today, people relate to the US dollar as being the dominant thing. Nobody remembers the Spanish dollar, which at one point in time, or the Dutch guilder at one point in time was the dominant currency, but now it's the US dollar, so everything is referenced in US dollars. So I think that well, I come from a technical background, and especially because most of the things that we use today come from the United States. Computers, the iPhone, and the programming languages was invented in the US. You do not program in any other language except the languages that are programmed by the programmers. So you take a program that is called Python, or if you want to program the internet, all of those are in a particular vocabulary made for the English language, a US language to be specific, not even a British language. Fascinating.
Yes, I do respect lots of those English language vocabularies. I also recognize that Western social thinkers, philosophers, and sociologists came up with lots of fascinating words, concepts, and frameworks, and they were useful. Like when we talk about peer produce field of knowledge production, we talk about social upward social mobility, or lots of those concepts. They are valid, they are useful. However, we should not abandon the effort to think about the power of indigenous wisdom and indigenous local culture and indigenous sources of inspiration, where we could draw upon. I think if here's one example that you're more familiar with, that when I was discussing the Zheng Guanying case with Professor Eric Hellinger, he kept asking me whether Zheng Guanying's thought of economic nationalism was influenced by the French nationalistic economic thinker, I think Frederick List. And I was trying to show him that Zheng Guanying came up with his own thought of Chinese economic nationalism, largely based off his personal experience of running business and his exposure to Western language source materials. Because, of course, learning English is important. Learning English was important for Zheng Guanying and for lots of modern Chinese thinkers. So he was able to combine his personal experience of running business in a highly modernized Shanghai, the British English and American settlement, with his reading of English language source materials and his independent thinking. He came up with his own independent thought on Chinese economic nationalism, without being influenced by any European thinkers. Because I think I was a historian of intellectual history. And in the study of intellectual history, we very often study who influenced whom. And it's normal to ask whether Zheng Guanying was influenced by a German thinker. But in this case, I would say, no, he was not, because he came up with his idea before that German thinker was even translated into Chinese. The List's work was translated into Chinese and it started to be read by Chinese readers, perhaps 20 or 30 years after Zheng Guanying published. And I also emphasized another fact, that China did not have a modern higher education system until very late. That means the first generation of modern Chinese thinkers like Zheng Guanying, Kang Youwei, and Liang Qichao, they were not college professors. They were not university professors who always read theoretical writing. Liang Qichao was a political activist to begin with. And then Liang Qichao was famous for his contribution to modern Chinese journalism.
Interesting.
He was still a politician in the 1920s. So when I was writing an kind of entry to introduce Liang Qichao's thinking on historiography for Bloomsbury publisher for their project, I also emphasized the thing that I did to Zheng Guanying, that Zheng Guanying was not a modern university-based scholar professor. He was not. He was a entrepreneur. He was a merchant.
Right.
Liang Qichao was not a college professor either. European scholars list or any other professors whom we put in a comparative framework are mostly university professors. But it's not in China. Zheng Guanying was not a professor. He did not publish for academic journals. Liang Qichao did not write for academic journals. Never. They wrote for the public because there was a reading public for Zheng Guanying's works, for Liang Qichao's works. They didn't write for other scholars. They wrote for the reading, a very broad reading public. That defined who they were and where they got their thoughts from and how they were going to process the information and who they wanted to speak to. So in this case, I would say, yes, Zheng Guanying came up with his own thoughts of economic nationalism of China as an indigenous Chinese thinking without being influenced by any Western thinker, because he didn't need to. he was so thoughtful, and he had so many experiences working in the business circles. He could write without being influenced by any Western professors.
Fascinating. This is very interesting, and your point is very well taken. Because if you were to compare some of the political science or even economic science, let's say Adam Smith, he was probably writing not necessarily for the public. He was writing for, for academia, right?
Right.
And Zheng Guanying was writing for the newspaper for it to be published, and it's only later that his book was actually printed on a much more formal basis.
He probably wrote for a general reading public when he was contributing to the Shenbao newspaper. He probably harbored an ambition of influencing the emperor, because his reading finally, after his writings were compiled into the book, the Shengshiweiyan, it was read, it was submitted to the Guangxu emperor by a governor. He probably had the ideal of influencing the government, but anyway, the academia was just not their primary target, I would say. So that's just one important context we should understand. In the first place, that's one thing. Another example, which I emphasized on my sometimes in my classes, sometimes in my books, is that Western terminologies largely probably influenced by modern American sociology since the early 20th century. They like to use lots of words, specific words like conflict, control, resistance, rebellion. And then they use the vocabulary here: conflict, control, resistance, rebellion. They use those words to study American society. And then the historical studies field about China also borrowed those words to study Chinese history. So, and then there are studies like, oh, let's talk about conflict and control in late Qing China. Let's always keep conflict and control and dominance when we study Chinese, any Chinese issues, Chinese politics, Chinese nationality issue, the 民族, right? The concept of the 中华民族 and different ethnic groups. I think it's a very Western way of thinking, very Western, very American, that they would approach the issue of Chinese national integration and modern nation building to build a modern 中华民族, also started by Liang Qichao, who built the conceptual framework. 中华民族 was a concept invented by Liang Qichao. And then there was a long discursive and political attempt to construct a 中华民族. And then below this 中华民族, there were different ethnic groups, including Hanzu, the Han people, and the other 55 ethnic minorities. Okay, that's a Chinese political process and largely a Chinese way of understanding the issue. But it seems to me that Western scholars would overemphasize these old terminologies and concepts like conflicts, control, resistance. And then they are going to interpret Chinese ethnic integration and national unity, the political process, as a process not unity and harmony, but full of conflicts, full of struggles, full of tensions, full of resistance. And they went to China to do their field work, probably with all of those terminologies in their mind. But in my research, I would remind them that, yes, I'm not saying that it's a perfect process without conflicts. There are conflicts. There were local voices, but it's more than that. It's more than that. It was also a process starting from Liang Qichao around 1904, 1905, where there was a serious attempt to build a unified, while internally diverse, 中华民族. And then, under the aegis of this 中华民族, which we sometimes translated as the Chinese nation, there are 56 officially labeled nationalities or 民族. So 民族 actually means two different things. The 中华民族 is the large 民族, and Han 民族 as
one of them.
Along with other minorities are also smaller 民族, but all of these 56 民族 would make up a larger and unified and coherent 中华民族. At least there was such an attempt, a process of cultural and political integration and cultural construction. But I would say lots of current American scholars are just not interested in this. They would find lots of flaws in the identification of ethnic minorities in China. And they would probably just carry in their mind all of those concepts about conflict, control, resistance, and write their books.
As this is extraordinarily interesting. And I'm very curious, because if we're talking about vocabulary, are you suggesting that the words as conflict, control, resistance, and rebellion were new concepts brought in from the Western into the Chinese world as we speak of? And is it perhaps because in the old, let's call it Confucius or Chinese cultural conflicts are not actually seen very good? You're supposed to be balanced, and that should not be. And so now you're bringing in something that is totally outside of the behavior or of the belief of the culture. And so conflict, control, resistance, rebellion, from a Western's point of view, it resonates to me as a divide and conquer, as a strategy.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe.
And
Yes.
in fact, taking it one step further, in the West particularly, and the US specifically, one way that the nation was created, and following the analogy of a Chinese nation made out of different kind of ethnic background. In the United States, we got rid of the word until recently, racist, because there's supposed to be no races. Everybody is equal. So maybe that's another way to be able to, instead of integrating, of just simply eliminating it. You don't talk about it. So you don't talk about Han, you don't talk about any of the minorities. And that's another way of saying we're integrating it. Nobody talks about it. You're prohibited by law to refer to, if you're Han nationality or Tibetan nationality, you don't talk about it. So that would be another way to deal with the issue. And then I would say, to finish, is that because the culture in the West is a lot more direct, just get rid of it directly rather than just indirectly.
Well, yeah, okay. Back to something you were just referring to. On Chinese citizens' ID, there is nationality, Han or other groups. But in China, it's actually an open discussion, because even when I was doing research in China, when I met with other Chinese scholars, I asked them whether it's desirable to just remove that label, remove the label of nationality from the ID, the Chinese 身份证. When you see the Han or others, it is desirable to just get rid of it. As you said, yes, if we are all Chinese citizens, then we don't need to specify that ethnic identity. Some scholars said it's hard. Probably we shouldn't do that. Some scholars that I interviewed and I met with actually strongly advocated tone down this type of ethnic identity. So I think in China, those things are being discussed. But there's the introduction of my book, my second book on these ethnic minority issues. I converted into a different chapter when I was approached to contribute to a volume published in Italy. So in that piece, I published it in Italy in English. I directly titled my article on Chinese nationality policies in 20th century, from Republican period to the PRC. I think I remember that I just titled that chapter a family of 56 nationalities or something like that. But the keyword here is family. Yes, as you said, Confucianism emphasizes harmony and unity over conflicts. Confucianism does admit that, of course, there are conflicts, there are dissonance, but a family should always live in harmony and try to deal with the conflicts still towards an end of unity and mutual feelings. So conflicts are there, but conflicts is not the end of everything. So to respond to what we said, why we cannot consider what a family or 家 means in Chinese culture, 爷 in Japanese, or overall in Asian culture, and consider why Chinese people would have the word called 国家, right? Why 国家 is a word compound in Chinese vocabulary. Why 国 and 家 would be combined to create a compound which makes Chinese people culturally, linguistically, semiotically think of the state and the family as one and the same thing very, very often. And you can't separate the country from your home. And why Western people do not try to understand what 国家 means for the Chinese people.
That's very interesting, because we would call it the motherland as a land,
right,
versus mother family, right? Or the very interesting. Well, the aspects of vocabulary and the intellectual decolonization, what do you think? Because, of course, and Sun Yat-sen did say that in a national struggle, and he was actually referring to the point of view of a foreign invasion, that was a lot easier to be able to detect the enemy when you saw their ships and their military coming toward you. That's very clear that there's an invasion coming in. The much more difficult invasion. In the case of what Dr. Zheng was talking about, was the what you would call intellectual invasion, and he was referring to particularly about the financial invasion, because in those days, as you may recall, after the Opium War, many of the tariff in terms of the finance of China and here was actually controlled to a major extent. So China lost a lot of the taxational revenues, and little at a time it came in to control financially. One portion of the decolonization, like you said, could have already started post World War II. And it is really easy to say that now we created the United Nations, and now we have close to 190 countries. And many of the countries before were colonies. But, you know, at one point in time, the British Empire had 130 something, 136 colonies and within their dominion. I believe that went down to 56, and these days it's probably a lot less than that. So many of those were decolonized. However, you could go to many countries like in Africa, which got many of the still the Dutch colonies that are now countries, or the Portuguese, and they are still not very much functioning as a sovereign entity. Their finances is not working, the economy is not working, many other things are not working. The only thing that you could say that is working is the political system. And so the question is, has the process of decolonization have gained the benefits, the ultimate benefits of being fully decolonized? And are we in the process of reaching that particular stage? Are we now beginning truly to a full functioning ability to be able to do an intellectual decolonization?
Well, if I understand this correctly, this actually reminds me of another thing, which is simply called that dependency theory, which describes the political economic relationship between Western countries and non-Western countries, and sometimes a lot of those Latin American countries whose national economy depend on countries like America. Some of those countries might, like, if you go to Hershey, you know, in Pennsylvania, there's the Hershey chocolate company, right? Their museum, their exhibits. I was there, and we brought our child, and we learned how to make chocolate. It's fun. But during the process, I was also noticing that when they were showing the audience where they got the cocoa, right, and to make chocolates, yes, some of the countries probably were assigned the status in this system of international political economy to just produce some raw materials. And then, but of course, the high-end chocolates are produced in America. But some of the countries were probably designated to a role, you're assigned a role to just produce those primitive, rudimentary raw materials, products. And under colonial system of political economy, it's very normal for the colonizers to assign the colonies just the status of producing one or two specific products that they need. Japanese did this in Taiwan, like sugarcane. You produce rubber, you produce sugarcane because that fits into the subtropical conditions that you have. But mainly, those were the things that the colonizers needed. They need you to produce one or two specific and designated products, and you just keep producing those things forever. Unless you are independent and you really want to change that dependency relationship. I mean, that's just probably my understanding might be shallow, but to develop your own more balanced and comprehensive system of national economy that you can produce other things. You can export, you can import, rather than only rely on rubber and rely on sugarcane or sugars. I mean, probably that's that political economic aspect. I think probably that's why China as a large country always emphasize that China is trying to build comprehensive systems of industrial sectors in China. And basically China produces everything. And China is one of the few countries in the world that can produce complicated things, simple things. Most of the industrial products can be produced in China, so that China will not be count on other countries. At least that was one major achievement of Chinese industrialization.
And another interesting portion that you're bringing up in here is that if you base it on the Chinese mentality of yin yang and cycles, there is a book and research by a professor and scholar by the name of Ian Morris, if I recall correctly. And his book is about measure of civilization, how to measure the civilization. He went back to, say, about 10,000 years in the history of the world. And the essence of it is that East and West, just like yin and yang, in terms of a cycle, plus and a minus, had one particular cycle time of the West, and 500 years later, roughly speaking, it was then switched over to the East, and there was an alternating East and West. And so if you measure the beginning of colonization with the discovery of America, 1492, and you take away a few decades in the process of being, accurate. So 500 years, it will be roughly about the year 2000. And if you then scientifically take some of the noise factors away in the process of it, are we now moving in the direction where that cycle is concluding, meaning that the decolonization process in here is beginning to start forming back into what is a more indigenous beginning? Because the idea of indigenous is more of the fact that we are actually, in the old days, there was no nation. In the old days, it was just people of the same culture mixing together. In especially China, people will speak only one dialect, and you will not talk about a national dialect because there was none. In Guangzhou or in other provinces, Fujian, I believe, there was a lot of mountains. There were many different variations of Guangzhounese, as I understand. And so that indigenous portion of it, you could really call it as being a self-sufficiency. And now, in fact, whether it's going on a natural way or being forced by political trade wars. For example, one of the issues in it is that semiconductors, particularly in China, which is forcing the Chinese to develop its own semiconductor intellectual uniqueness. For example, on the technical side, all computers run on something that is called an operating system. And the operating system in the world right now was invented in the US. And no matter whether it's China, India, Pakistan, or the Middle East, or Germany, is the same operating system. There's really no reason why the operating system cannot be invented one in China. In fact, Huawei came out because of being forced by trade rules or to be able to create its own operating system instead of relying on Android or the Apple iOS. And so it's not impossible, and it's being forced. So the question now is that is other countries in here now are beginning to see and realize that, wait a moment, I have my own needs, and maybe I should rely less on import because I don't want to be so dependent on things like a particular currency, except my own currency, and be less dependent on the financial and currency infrastructure of it. And what happens if that's the case? Well, there's a lot of advantages, because if I don't hold my assets in US denomination, then you cannot confiscate it and eliminate it all of a sudden, like they did to Russia, for example. And without putting any political spin or accusing anybody of that, is that more of a natural evolution of people realizing that, wait a moment, maybe I should be more independent, and maybe that's why economic nationalism is beginning to gain more and more of an attraction?
Yes, I think my understanding might be that because we have seen this globalization, which largely increased and enhanced the economic integration of different nation states in the past several decades. But globalization serves the interest of countries like America who initiate it. But when America feels that it works against it, it causes the loss of jobs at home, they would return back to protectionism. So now how do we understand this? It's probably still about interests, economic interests, and the national interests, because free trade can be used as an ideology. Globalization can be, and protectionism could also be employed when it is necessary. Those seem to be more like instruments to advance national interests. For me, it's because that's probably something we are seeing now. They are always changing. They are always changing. So for countries that are actually in a weaker station, I must emphasize this weak country, because sometimes I would tell Americans that American people lack a feeling of weaker countries, because America has been strong for a long time. They could hardly feel for weaker countries what weaker countries wanted, because the world is still unequal. The world is still hierarchical. There are strong countries and there are weak countries, and that was why Frederick List, even from a German point of view, because when he was advancing his theory of economic nationalism in the 1910s, 1920s, Germany was also a latecomer of modernization. So he was trying to build an alternative theoretical framework to replace Adam Smith. was because Adam Smith spoke from the standpoint of the strong. Zheng Guanying was from the standpoint of a weak country. List was also speaking from the weaker's point of view. I think that was exactly what eventually made Professor Eric Hellener think and rethink why some countries needed national economic nationalism and protectionism for at a certain point or to a certain degree, because they were latecomers of modernization and they were weaker countries. Why they couldn't pursue protectionism while they need to be protected? Why Adam Smith or free trade is not the only answer to the world? And why, when globalization started to hurt the interests of some Americans, like it caused the loss of employment among some of the blue-collar Americans, American business world or maybe the government would also turn to protectionism. They're also going to try to restrict foreign goods, Chinese goods. Also do the same, probably for me, mostly the same thing, that other people are trying to protect themselves.
Well, going back to your statement of vocabulary, the word globalization wasn't used for a long while altogether. And then all of a sudden, it's kind of the fashion of business to globalize. And in fact, if you relate that back to the free markets, well, free markets may be good for one side. Perhaps if you're talking about the dominant empire, you want free markets. But then free markets means that you go to a colonized country and say you have to open up your market.
Right.
To me,
exactly.
But on the other hand, if you are a weaker country, you may not want to open up the market because you're actually allowing your currency, your savings, to be buying imports, and so you have an imbalance there that is weakening even further. You don't have enough capital on reserve, yet you keep on buying. And if the dominant currency in this case is the US dollar, then you need to keep on exchanging more your local currency for more US dollars. And so free market is yet another interesting thought as to, it really depends on whether you are in the side of the strong or whether you are in the side of the weak. And so
yes.
In a globalization, is globalizing good? Well, globalizing is very good if I can actually promote my products to everybody, but it may not be so good if I'm actually the one that is suffering from that flow.
It depends on what position you are in. It's simple. If we just go back to Chinese history, the so-called Opium War or commercial war from a British point of view, if it's not really for opium as an item, it's for trade, it's for free market, as you said, or free trade. Fundamentally, that was only because Britain had a surplus. They produced too many cotton products, right? They couldn't consume that many cotton products in their domestic market. Then they must open up overseas market. They must push for the other foreign markets to buy their cotton. That's all.
My recollection, it was that the silver, they did not have a lot of gold, but the silver was actually being used to be able to buy practically all of the Chinese goods, which is happening right now.
Right.
So in those days, you could not print dollars like you do today, which are printed not even by printing paper. You just put a couple of zeros in the computers, and that is the printing of the money. But in the old days, you have to be sending more and more silver, and when your silver is being depleted in the country, then you have a reserve problem altogether. So this is this issue of dependency is another thing that I wanted to ask you, and this is probably where a lot of people want to express more. We hear a lot of these questions, and this conversation here is fascinating because it opens a lot of future thoughts that I'm very sure that many people want to actually take into consideration. And another interesting portion of it with the vocabulary, it comes from the fact that most strong colonizers are not the intellectual countries. It tends to be more the barbarian countries. For example, my understanding is that the Romans did not have much of a culture. They had to go borrow it from the Greeks, but that's after they conquered most of the land. And so the question then it becomes that once you colonize a place, you definitely want to impart some sort of a culture. And I believe that in the days of Genghis Khan didn't have much of a culture. Genghis Khan did not know how to read or write, to my understanding. And then he adopted the local culture there, and he allowed the local culture to be the predominant, culture. And so going back to the indigenous value, because that's what the indigenous society brings in, and taking, for example, the United States or in Latin America, where I came from originally, you have the Spanish who came into the local land, and there was a several hundreds, perhaps thousands of years of indigenous natives throughout the American continent. It's not the American continent did not have people. The culture of the people in here, which is very long forgotten, nobody really has written much about it, except that we know that in Mexico there was the Incas and the Mayans culture altogether. But in the United States, you had the Cherokee, and you have many of the lost native indigenous. I know that in the South, we have many of the so-called tribes. And it's not true that the tribes were illiterates and uncultured. They had their medicine, they could cure themselves, they had their own economy, they have their own, you cannot call them laws because the word law is really different. And in fact, my understanding in utilizing the vocabulary of conflict, control, resistance, and rebellion, the legal system, there was no legal system. The word legal didn't exist in the native vocabulary, but the indigenous framework for the policies, it was very clear. All tribes follow their own, what you call today, laws and policies. And it was indeed the fact that the colonizers brought in the new concept of a treaty and says, now we're going to make peace if you sign this treaty.
I see.
And it is a fact, this is documented, that because the indigenous did not really understand what the treaty was, and they took it for a goodwill. Well, you're saying we're going to have peace because the indigenous won most of the wars or most of the battles against the foreigners. And after losing, the foreigner said, well, let's have a treaty. And then we would submit, and then everybody lays out the arms. And then that worked quite well. And then, of course, history goes that the treaty were not followed because it was a technicality in the treaties that most indigenous could not read, because most indigenous also try to learn, like Zheng Guanying, try to learn English to be able to relate more to this more modernized society. And so most native started learning the foreign languages, but the majority of them did not. Just like in China, the majority of the people did not understand English, even to today. And even today, many people speak more English, but the technicalities in the language, in what could be the treaties or the laws, which is being used as the understanding, is what traps everybody.
Well, this is just very, very normal, even in modern societies, even for us. I would still think this is a kind of power relationship between the strong and the weak.
Right.
Think about when we engage with an insurance company and we are going to sign that treaty or the contract. How many of those technical details do I really understand? And do they really understand it? They, of course, know much, much better than I do. And all of those terms had already been crafted and put it there. And there are so many, many pages. How to interpret those? How to understand those clauses? Largely, you probably still have to live on the mercy of those people who draft it. And the only thing most of the time, even when I was signing my publishing contracts with the publishers, I also found that I was in a weak position because you already drafted everything. There were 40 articles. I have to understand what you are trying to say, but I do not have the right to. Basically, it's hard for me to revise anything. The only thing I could do was just to put my name there. I probably could negotiate a little bit if I really try to. I'm so persistent or I'm strong enough. But think about this relationship that when you are going to sign a contract, how many times you negotiate those articles with the other party, and how many times you simply put your name on a completed document with multiple articles that you understand and or somewhere between full understanding and not so understanding, but okay, let's just forget about it. Okay, let me just put my name there and get things done. It's probably similar. And the situation could be worse, much, much worse in the scenario that you described, because those were even weaker people. But even we could feel that we are put in a weak position when we are signing a treaty, signing a contract, when dealing with the insurance companies or even publishers. Because even for me, I think I have read a lot, but it's still not easy for me to understand what all those articles really entail in the future. Thank you for bringing that up. I think I would still understand that as a kind of power relationship. It is.
It is. It really is, and is the commonality in human behavior, and that is actually fascinating. You could almost put it in the context of the Chinese philosophy. First of all, you have change. That is the only constant. Change is the only constant. So we're constantly changing, and we're constantly changing in a process of strength and weakness. So one side is a strong one, the other one is a weak one, and maybe circumstances changes and the weak one becomes the strong one, and the strong one becomes the weak one.
Yeah. Oh, that's very Taoist. Yeah.
And
Very Taoist.
actually, some people claim on the Chen Guanying writing that Chen Guanying was a Taoist, but in reality, in speaking to many of the family members and also having the benefit of being, in business, then you actually realize. And one question that I always ask is, why did Zheng Guanyin put in the beginning of the first chapter of his book about the Tao?
Right, correct. Right. I noticed that.
And the interpretation that I had from the family is because Zheng Guanyin suffered a lot at the end was because of the trust that he put on people. In the old Tao Te Ching, it was Tao Te. Well, people did not have Tao Te, and that's how he ended up in big difficulties toward the end, which concludes the possibility that you must have Tao Te. And let me tell you that from the very beginning. But other aspects of the introduction on it, as you recall, he was describing about the interaction of yin yang. Most Chinese books that are deep enough have to connect all the way back, if it's not to the Yellow Emperor, but also connect back to the Chinese theory, and the deepest theory that I still believe is practical today, and we're seeing it right now: colonization, decolonization, yin and yang, and the process of change. And so, and this goes back to what Ray Dalio says, is because in the history of this 500 years, we've seen how empires have actually came from nowhere. Portugal didn't have much. Great Britain was actually a very poor country. Europe in general was not very rich. And then you have a very rich country in those days, which was India, Africa, and China. Africa was a very rich country at one point in time. And then now it's a very poor country. China became very poor, and now is regaining back its original position. So I think that this process of change is going to be very interesting. And I also believe that the process of decolonization, based on your definition, perhaps is taking a very strong shape now. And I may interpret that this decolonization is now the intellectual, which is the more young, the more unseen portion of the decolonization, because the political decolonization was a piece of paper signed that say, now you are decolonized. You are a country now. You are now a sovereign country. But in reality, the dependencies were built into the system where you're not really decolonized, because you're still buying all of the things in here. In fact, that is the treaty or the agreement that was made on the on the one country, two system of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is part of China now, but the court systems and many things in here are internal, still remains. Point in case, many of the companies that were from the old British Empire, starting with HSBC, Cathay Pacific. Cathay is still very dominantly a British company, and so is HSBC. So all of those, let's call it portions of the more softer colonization, you can actually still see the dependency and the profits, which still go back to the old colonizer. And you cannot blame them for that, because from a business perspective, although you're forced to give away the business to somebody else, as a businessman, you're always trying to find a hook to make sure that you're still benefiting from it for as long as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah. How about this? I can't go too deep on issues like HSBC, those type of financial industry things, but I might want to wrap up with two thoughts. First, if we look at the background you are using, right, the symbol, the Taoist symbol, yin and yang, we can also use this to rethink or to challenge this Western way of thinking about absolute dichotomy between, okay, black and white, darkness versus brightness. In China, yes, look at this Taoist symbol. We do see black and white,
yes,
but they are not only ever changing, they are moving, they are fluid, and they are interactive. And more importantly, we see black, the black dot inside the white area, and we see the white dot in that black area. So they were mixed, fluid, and always in motion. And that's probably another way, a Chinese way, which we could exploit as an important source of inspiration to understand and re-understand the world. That the world is not only a dichotomy between good versus evil, black versus white. There are black and white, but they were so mixed, and there's a piece of black in whiteness and whiteness in blackness. That's another way to look at this. While I was studying Buddhism these days, I just also want to just use this quote from a book in which an American scholar studies Buddhism in South Asia. Here we can also see how an American scholar could change his more typical Western way of thinking while he was trying to approach Eastern religion and Eastern culture. The quote is like this: thus they have come to regard Buddhism and Hinduism as entities precisely on the par with the monotheistic religions, primarily Christianity and Islam, and consequently to regard Buddhist and Hindu as total and mutually exclusive identities. Here, the author was actually criticizing old Western way of thinking that had been deeply influenced by the entrenched Christian thinking, that if there are religions, then religions are mutually exclusive. But this author is trying to say maybe that's Christianity, but that's not the religions in India. Because in India, religions, or of course, religion itself is a very modern Western word. Because in China, we know 教 means teaching more than a organized religion in modern Western sense. That's another point of dispute. Okay, but if we follow this author, who is correct for me, that Buddhist and Hindu are not mutually exclusive in India. This applies to China too. In China, why we emphasize syncretism, in which Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism could be combined and they could speak to each other, because they are not and never mutually exclusive.
And so is Japan as well.
Right.
You can actually be Buddhist and Taoist and Christian at the same time.
Right. Then if we're not being judgmental, if this can be a way of thinking and a way of life, can be a way of life in India, in China, and in Japan, then why we should not rethink this Western mode of thinking that must create absolute and mutually exclusive dichotomy between this and that, between one religion and all other religions? Because we do see this coexistence. We do see the lack of this mutual exclusiveness in India, in China, and in Japan. But how we can use this, including this mutual transformation of the yin and yang in this symbol, we use this framework to understand the world all over again.
Well, Professor Wu, this is a fascinating
Thank you.
Get together here. I'm
Thank you.
very happy, and we want to actually have a sequel to this most interesting presentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zheng. Very nice talking to you today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.